3 armed bandits against 1 old railwayman. No help for miles. No escape. They thought they had trapped a helpless victim. They were wrong, because when the old man turned off the lights and picked up his axe, the hunters became the prey. This is the chilling true story of the night the Siberian railway ran red. The 294th verst of the Siberian railway met the night with a white, impenetrable shroud that blanketed the taiga, erasing the boundaries between sky and earth and turning the familiar landscape into a chaos of flying snow and howling wind. The blizzard had started suddenly as if someone up above had slit the belly of a massive sack filled with ice grit, and now the elements were raging, trying to sweep away everything in their path, including the small track walker's hut, huddled against the embankment. Zakhar, an old track walker hardened by years of service, pulled his hood lower over his forehead, shielding his face with a mitten from the stinging lashes of the wind, and stubbornly marched along the track, checking the rails, because this habit had etched itself into his bones over 30 years of service, and had become as inevitable as breathing. Even in weather like this, when a good master wouldn't turn a dog out into the yard, the service demanded inspection, and Zakhar knew that if he missed a crack in a rail or a drift on a switch, it could cost the lives of hundreds of people. The rails hummed under the pressure of the wind, vibrating like the taut strings of a giant instrument, warning that nature was not in good spirits today, while the lantern in Zakhar's hand, swaying from side to side, snatched from the darkness only slanting strokes of snow and snow-covered sleepers that looked like the ribs of a colossal skeleton. The kerosene wick sputtered, the glass was sooty, and the light was dim, yellow, and sickly, barely piercing the milky murk of the storm. Zakhar stopped at a switch. The mechanism, greased with thick grease just yesterday, had now turned into an ice sculpture, and snow had packed into the gaps between the point and the stock rail, compressed into stone. The old man sighed, a cloud of steam instantly carried away by the wind into the darkness. He set the lantern on the snow, pulled a scraper from his belt, and began to clear the ice, working methodically and stubbornly, hearing the metal grate against metal, striking sparks that instantly died in the snowbank. His hands inside the sheepskin mittens were numb, but Zakhar did not hurry, realizing that if the switch froze solid, the morning freight train might derail, and a wreck on his section would mean hard labor. Though looking at the endless dead whiteness around him, Zakhar thought that penal servitude differed little from his current life as a lonely widower. He had lived alone for 5 years now, ever since his wife died of typhus. The children had scattered to the cities and didn't write, and only his dog Polkin, a huge, shaggy Siberian wolfhound, brightened his solitude in the company hut, warming the cold evenings with his heat. Having finished with the switch, Zakhar straightened up, his lower back cracking, feeling the wind intensify, droning somewhere high above the tops of the cedars as if a cast-iron shell were flying there, and picking up the lantern he headed back to the house, the light in the window of which was invisible, as the blizzard hid everything within 5 paces. He walked by memory, counting the telegraph poles, 10, 11, and at the 12th, he stopped dead, because the telegraph wire, usually taut between the insulators, was now sagging in a pitiful loop and disappearing into a snowbank, which meant a break and no connection to the station. If a train got stuck or trouble struck, there was nowhere to wait for help. He was alone for dozens of versts, and this thought, usually familiar, today for some reason, pricked him under the ribs with a cold needle of anxiety, for there was something evil, unnatural, and foreboding in this blizzard. Reaching the porch, He spent a long time sweeping his felt boots with a broom so as not to drag snow into the hut. The door opened with difficulty, propped up by a drift, and he tumbled inside along with clouds of steam. Inside it was warm and smelled of habitation, dry herbs, coarse tobacco, and cabbage soup simmering in the stove, and Polkan, dozing by the hearth, raised his large head and growled deeply, but recognizing his master, immediately thumped his tail on the floor. "Quiet, it's me," Zakhar grunted, hanging his heavy, frozen sheepskin coat on a nail. He walked to the table where a second lamp stood and turned up the wick, making the light brighter, chasing the shadows into the corners and illuminating the sturdy, 5-walled, government-issued log cabin. In the icon corner, the faces of saints darkened, a lampada flickering beneath them. On the wall hung an old Burden rifle, the trackwalker's faithful companion, and a bandolier, reminders that the times were turbulent. Trains with cripples and embittered soldiers were coming from the east. Escaped convicts roamed the taiga, and revolution, as the train engineers said, had already ignited riots in the cities. Here, in the backwoods, news arrived a month late, but the scent of trouble seemed to be carried by the wind, and Zakhar, pouring himself a mug of hot tea from the samovar and breaking off a piece of stale bread, sat by the window, trying to see at least something through the frozen glass. But there was only darkness. The telegraph apparatus on the small table in the corner was silent, although usually at this hour the duty officer from the station tapped out a check. But now the copper key was frozen like a dead finger, and the silence in the house was dense, oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and the howling of the wind in the chimney. Suddenly Polkan jumped up, the hackles on his neck standing on end. The dog growled low and gutturally, staring at the door, and Zakhar froze with the mug at his mouth, knowing the dog wouldn't bark for nothing. It wasn't a bear, which sleeps in winter, and not wolves, which would howl. "Who's there?" Zakhar asked the dog quietly, slowly setting the mug on the table. But Polkan didn't answer. He walked to the door and sniffed at the crack in the threshold, grumbling deeply, and then Zakhar heard, through the howl of the wind, a heavy, persistent knocking of something hard against the solid wood of the door. Boom, boom, boom. They weren't knocking with a hand, but perhaps with a rifle butt or the handle of a knife, and Zakhar rose soundlessly, stepped to the wall, took down the Berdan rifle, which always had a cartridge in the chamber, the rule of the taiga, and cocked the hammer, the click of which sounded like a gunshot in the silence. "Who is it?" he shouted without approaching the door, his voice firm, not senile, and behind the door, there was silence for a moment. Then a voice came, muffled by the thick wood and the wail of the blizzard, demanding to open up because they were people, and they were freezing. "Open up, Father! We're freezing! We're people!" the voice shouted, hoarse and strained. But there was something in it Zakhar didn't like, a tone too commanding for someone begging for help. "What people?" he asked, holding the barrel aimed at chest level. "Where from on a night like this?" And the voice replied with notes of irritation that they were hunters. They had gotten lost, fallen behind the convoy, and were asking to be let in for Christ's sake, or they would freeze to death. Zakhar frowned, realizing that hunters wouldn't stick their noses out of a winter cabin in such a blizzard. They sense the weather a day in advance, and besides, fur-bearing animals had long been scared away by the trains here. "No windows to check," Zakhar muttered to himself, "and if you open the door, you can't slam it back shut." And Polkan burst into barking, no longer holding back, throwing himself at the door, to which someone outside barked back to quiet the dog, adding that their comrade had frostbitten legs and couldn't walk, threatening that if he didn't open, it would be worse. It would be worse. This slip of the tongue grated on his ears. They weren't asking, they were demanding. And Zakhar understood his choice was small. The door was strong, but if they had an axe or a crowbar, they would break it down. And if they started shooting through the windows, he would be trapped in the hut, and by law, he was obliged to render aid to those in distress. "Step away from the door," he shouted. "I'm unbolting it now. No funny business. I have buckshot for wild boar. It'll tear half your gut out." And he approached the door, holding the rifle with one hand, while the other groped for the heavy iron bolt, the cold of which burned his fingers. Zakhar yanked back the bolt, pushed the door with his shoulder, and a cloud of frosty steam, snow, and a vortex of icy air burst into the hut, making the flame in the lamp flare and nearly go out, causing shadows to dance a wild dance on the walls. 3 men stood on the threshold, and the one who had spoken entered first. Tall, in a snow-covered fur coat, his hood wrapped in a scarf so that only his eyes were visible, eyes that were sharp, prickly, and light. And he immediately stepped aside, clearing the way, while his hand slid under the flap of his coat with a practiced movement, the way one grabs a revolver or a knife. Following him, a second man lumbered in, huge as a bear, a silent giant carrying a third man who hung like a rag, groaning and favoring one leg. But Zakhar, with his practiced eye of an old soldier, noticed a strange detail. The wounded man was holding his hand not to his leg, but to his side, and on the snow that fell from his clothes, dark stains remained, almost black in the lamplight. Blood. "Close it. What are you waiting for?" The first one barked, pulling the scarf from his face, and Zakhar slammed the door, leaning his whole weight against it, and slid the bolt back, cutting off the wind outside, which howled in disappointment. It became quiet in the hut, only the heavy breathing of the new arrivals disturbing the peace, and the old man retreated to the table, not lowering his rifle. Now he could examine them, and what he saw, he didn't like at all. The one who called himself a hunter threw back his hood. His face was predatory with sharp cheekbones and a scar slashing across his eyebrow. Age indefinite, maybe 30, maybe 40. Hair cut short, almost to the root, the way they cut hair in typhus barracks or in prison. The bear set the wounded man on the bench. The man threw his head back, and Zakhar saw the pale, sweaty face of a very young guy whose lips were bitten until they bled, and he wheezed a request for water. Zakhar shifted his gaze to their footwear, and a cold dread, scarier than the cold outside, crawled down his spine, because the hunters were wearing neither felt boots nor fur boots. On the feet of the leader were boots, good, leather, chrome boots, city boots with thin soles, which in the taiga meant certain death. And the trousers tucked into the boot tops were of fine cloth, but dirty, torn, stained with grease and clay, which said that real hunters didn't dress like that. And the weapon hanging behind the bear's back wasn't for hunting. It was an army cavalry carbine with a shortened barrel. You'd only spoil the pelt shooting a beast with that. That was for killing people. "What, Grandpa, don't recognize us?" the leader sneered, noticing Zakhar's gaze, and unbuttoned his coat, beneath which a gold watch chain gleamed across a dirty shirt, claiming they were merchants buying furs. But wolves attacked. The horses bolted. The sleigh overturned. They barely fought them off, and their comrade got hit. He lied brazenly, looking straight into Zakhar's eyes, not even trying to make the lie sound truthful. He didn't care if the old man believed him or not. Zakhar slowly lowered the Berdan rifle but didn't remove his finger from the trigger, drawling that if it was wolves, let them come to the stove. There was tea, realizing that if he showed fear now or started asking questions, they would kill him on the spot. There were 3 of them, and even if he dropped one, the other 2 would tear him apart. Polkan growled, cowering under the table, sensing the scent coming from the guests, which was not the scent of the taiga or a beast, but the scent of prison, fear, and someone else's blood. The bear slid a heavy sack from his shoulder and set it on the floor with a dull thud. The sound was heavy, metallic, as if there were stones or church plate inside, and from the corner of the sack, a thick, dark drop fell onto the clean, scraped floor, and Zakhar realized he wouldn't live to see dawn if he didn't come up with something. "We need fuel, Grandpa," said the leader, sitting at the table without invitation and pulling Zakhar's mug toward him, placing his hands on the table, hands where faded prison tattoos turned blue on the knuckles. "No vodka," Zakhar answered dryly. "Only government spirit for the lamps," to which the guest grinned, and there was nothing human in his smile, stating they weren't proud and demanding the spirit and food. Everything there was. The blizzard raged outside the window, cutting them off from the whole world. The wire was broken. The train was only due in the morning. And in the hut were 3 wolves in human form and 1 old soldier who very much wanted to live. Zakhar placed a heavy cast-iron pot of yesterday's cabbage soup on the table, and steam smelling of sour cabbage and old lard hit the low ceiling, mixing with the heavy stench of unwashed bodies and wet sheepskin. But the guests didn't wait for an invitation. The 2 healthy ones attacked the food greedily, like beasts, fishing out chunks of meat with dirty fingers and burning themselves, but not stopping their chewing, as if they hadn't seen hot food for a week or more. The 3rd, the wounded one, lay on the bench by the stove, breathing heavily. His face was gray as ash in the ash pit, and the whites of his eyes shone feverishly, wandering around the hut and stopping on nothing, while the leader, the one in the boots, ate quickly but neatly, never taking his sharp, prickly gaze off Zakhar. A gaze with no gratitude, only the cold calculation of a predator assessing its prey. The bread, which Zakhar cut into thick slices, vanished from the table in the blink of an eye, and the leader, wiping his greasy lips with his sleeve, leaned back against the back of the bench, which creaked pitifully under his weight, demanding the spirit in a voice that sent chills down the skin stronger than the blizzard outside. And Zakhar silently reached into the cupboard where, among bottles of medicine and balls of twine, stood the precious bottle of government spirit, issued for cleaning contacts and lamps, but which in the taiga was currency harder than gold. He knew it was useless to argue. They would drink it all, and if he didn't give it, they would turn the hut upside down and find it themselves, only after turning his soul inside out first. So he placed the cloudy bottle on the table along with 3 tin mugs, and the leader, splashing himself a generous portion of undiluted fire, exhaled and tossed it down his throat without even grimacing, as if he had drunk water, grunting with pleasure. The bear, the one who had carried the wounded man, drank noisily, whistling, and after every mug his gaze became heavier, filling with murky malice, and he began to side-eye Zakhar like a butcher looks at a bull ready for slaughter, until the wounded man on the bench suddenly groaned, trying to sit up. His hand scratched convulsively at the boards, leaving bloody smears, and he began to wheeze in delirium about a priest, a cross, and some matrena, begging forgiveness for striking with an axe. Zakhar felt everything inside him tighten into a knot. Now he knew exactly who was sitting at his table. These weren't just fugitives, they were murderers who had robbed a church or a wealthy house, and their hands were bloody to the elbows. And Zakhar's gaze involuntarily darted to the sack the bear had thrown by the stove. The fabric was wet from melted snow and clung tightly to the contents, and now the sharp corners of something hard and rectangular, resembling heavy icon frames or gold vessels, could be clearly distinguished. The leader intercepted this glance. His eyes narrowed into two slits, and he slowly, lazily, placed his hand on the table next to the knife he'd just used to cut the bread, asking quietly if the grandpa found it interesting, his voice gentle like a babbling brook. But in that babble, Zakhar heard a death sentence. "You live richly, merchants," Zakhar answered calmly, trying to keep his voice from trembling and looking straight into the bandit's eyes, because he knew that if he looked away, he would show fear. And fear to people like this was like the scent of blood to a shark, to which the leader chuckled, toying with the knife, the blade of which shone dully in the light of the kerosene lamp standing at the edge of the table, and advised the grandpa not to look too much, or his eyes would hurt. The bear sitting next to him guffawed, baring rotten teeth, and Zakhar realized his time was running out with every minute. They would finish eating, finish the spirit, and then he would become unnecessary to them, even dangerous as a witness who had seen their faces and heard the wounded man's delirium, who screamed again, arching his back so that the bandage on his side soaked through with fresh blood, black in the semi-darkness. The bear stood up, walked over to him, and with a swing punched him in the head, causing the boy to go limp and silent, and indifferently tossed out that whether you treat him or not, he'll die anyway, returning to the table and pouring himself more spirit. His movements became uncoordinated, sweeping. The vodka was taking its toll, but this made him even more dangerous, unpredictable. The leader, however, hardly got drunk. He sat straight, and his brain seemed to be working clearly, calculating options, and suddenly he asked to see the rifle hanging on the wall, causing Zakhar to go cold, realizing this was the end. If they took the weapon, he would be left with bare hands against two cutthroats. "It's not loaded," Zakhar lied, taking a step back, closer to the stove, away from the table and the lamp. But the leader sneered, saying they would check, and began to stand up, kicking the bench aside. And at that moment, Zakhar realized he couldn't wait any longer. One more second, and this wolf in human skin would grab the rifle, and then there would be no chance left at all. The old man's gaze fell on the lamp, the only sun in this universe of logs and darkness. The glass was hot. The wick burned steadily, giving life to shadows. The bear reached for the bottle, his elbow just an inch from the lamp but missing it, while the leader took a step toward Zakhar, and in his hand was no longer a knife, but the confidence of an executioner walking to the block. "Well, hand over the toy." He extended his hand, and Zakhar, as if submitting, nodded, pretending to go to the wall for the rifle, but his path lay past the table. Polkan growled deeply under the bench, sensing his master's tension, the dog ready to lunge but waiting for a command, and Zakhar knew he would have only one attempt, one moment when darkness would become his ally, and his knowledge of his own hut his weapon. He pulled level with the bear, who had thrown his head back to pour the last of the spirit into his mouth, and as if tripping over a floorboard, lurched sharply forward. The bear barked, but it was too late. Zakhar wasn't falling. He threw his body into a precisely calculated swing, and his hand, hard as driftwood, swept the lamp off the table. The glass shattered with a ring, hitting the floor. Burning kerosene splashed in a fiery puddle that instantly hissed and went out, smothered by Zakhar's heavy boot, and the hut plunged into absolute inky, impenetrable darkness, in which all landmarks instantly dissolved for the strangers, but not for the master. The darkness fell instantly, thick, sticky, smelling of burning and spilled spirit, and for the first moment a silence hung in the hut, so dense that the ringing in ears from the broken glass seemed like a roar. But Zakhar didn't wait for his eyes to adjust, because there was nothing to adjust to. There was no light left at all. He simply dropped to the floor, rolling toward the stove, to the corner where an armful of firewood lay, and where the cleaving axe stood, which he had brought in yesterday to split kindling. To the left, where the bear was sitting, came the crash of an overturned bench and a drunken, furious roar. The bandit groped in the void, trying to find the old man, but grabbed only air, and his heavy boots stomped on the floorboards, shaking the floor, making the dishes on the table rattle pitifully. "Don't shoot, you fool! You'll hit me," hissed the leader's voice, and this whisper sounded scarier than a scream, because it came not from the table, but from somewhere to the side. The leader had also moved. He was smart, and knew that staying in place meant becoming a target. Zakhar froze, pressing his back against the rough bricks of the stove. His hand found the smooth, cold handle of the axe, and his fingers gripped it until they crunched. Now he wasn't unarmed, and although an axe was weak protection against a revolver, in this inky mess, the odds were evened. Chaos reigned in the hut. The wounded man on the bench whined and then screamed. Apparently someone in the dark had stepped on his bad leg or brushed his side, and this scream served as a signal for the bear, who, orienting himself by the noise, lunged forward, his breathing wheezing and heavy, approaching. He swung his arms like a windmill, and suddenly his fist crashed into the stove damper just an inch from Zakhar's head. "Ah, you bastard," the giant exhaled, realizing the victim was near, and Zakhar understood he couldn't delay. He didn't see the enemy, but he smelled him, a mixture of alcohol fumes and sweat, and rising to one knee, he struck with the axe backhanded with force, putting all his old man's sinewy anger into the blow, aiming where the sound came from. The blade didn't meet bone. It thudded dully into something soft, and the bear howled, not from a mortal wound, but from pain and surprise. The axe apparently hit his arm or shoulder, but that was enough for the giant to stagger and retreat, taking the table down with him. And then a shot rang out, the flash for a split second snatching from the gloom the twisted face of the leader, kneeling by the door, and the barrel of the Nagant revolver aimed toward the stove. The bullet chipped brick right above Zakhar's ear, showering him with prickly dust and deafening him with the roar in the enclosed space. The light went out as quickly as it had appeared, but now Zakhar knew where the main enemy was. He was at the exit, cutting off the path to salvation, which meant he couldn't go through the door while he was there. And the bear, howling in pain, charged again like a bull, now no longer picking his path. He simply wanted to kill, trample, destroy. Zakhar, realizing he couldn't handle this wounded beast in a tight corner, hurled a heavy log he found on the floor toward the table, and the thud of wood against the floor made the leader shoot again, at the sound, wasting precious cartridges. At that moment, Zakhar, crouching low, dashed to the window, the only way out the shooter didn't control. The glass was small, double-paned, frozen, but there was no choice. Zakhar struck the frame with the butt of the axe, the ring of broken glass drowning in the howl of the blizzard, which immediately burst into the hut with an icy tongue, throwing a handful of snow into his face. "Get him! He's getting away!" the leader yelled and fired again, now blindly. The bullet zinged somewhere in the logs of the wall, but Zakhar no longer heard. Ignoring the sharp shards sticking out of the frame, he climbed out, tearing his coat and the skin on his hands. The cold burned his face. The wind hit him in the chest, trying to push him back. But Zakhar, bracing his feet against the windowsill, tumbled into the snowbank, falling face first into the prickly, hard snow. He immediately rolled to the side, under the protection of the earth bank around the house. And just in time, because from the window, which now gaped like a black hole, a hand with a nagant poked out and spat fire twice into the night. But the bullets went wide, dissolving in the storm. Zakhar jumped to his feet, sinking waist-deep in snow, and crouching, ran toward the tracks, where the wind roamed freely, but where one could hide behind the embankment. Behind him, from the broken window, cursing and commotion could be heard. Apparently the bear, despite his wound, was also trying to climb out, or the leader was pushing him, clearing the way. Zakhar realized he'd left everything in the hut: rifle, cartridges, warm clothes, except what he was wearing. And now he was alone in the middle of a blizzard against armed bandits. But he had an advantage. He knew every bush, every pit, every sleeper here. He ran to the switch he had cleaned an hour ago and fell behind the switching mechanism, trying to catch his breath. His heart pounded somewhere in his throat. His hands trembled, but his head was clearer than ever. A dark silhouette tumbled out of the hut window, followed by a second, more agile one. It was the leader. He shouted something to the first one, and that one, limping and holding his shoulder, moved toward the tracks. They weren't planning to leave. They understood the old man was the only witness, and as long as he was alive, they would have no peace. Besides, they needed warmth, and you can't sit long in a hut with a broken window. Zakhar gripped the axe tighter, which he hadn't let go of. It was a poor weapon against a revolver and a carbine, but better than nothing. The wind died down a little. Or maybe Zakhar just got used to its howl, but now he distinctly heard the crunch of snow under the pursuers' boots. They were walking in a chain, spread out, trying to cut him off from the forest. The leader was smart. He realized the old man would head for the taiga, but Zakhar stayed by the embankment. He knew that in the forest in such weather, death would come faster from the cold than from a bullet. But here, on the tracks, there was a chance. Suddenly, through the howl of the wind, a new sound broke through, distant but growing, a low rumble that made the ground tremble underfoot. It was a train, a freight or postal train, running late because of the blizzard, but still punching through the drifts. And this was a chance. Zakhar realized what he had to do. He couldn't just run away, leaving the bandits here. They could derail the train or slaughter the crew if they stopped. He had to stop them. The leader heard the whistle too. He stopped, peering into the snowy murk, and his silhouette froze for a moment. Zakhar raised his head above cover, estimating the distance. The bandit was 30 paces away, too far for an axe throw, but close enough not to spot him in the dark. The rumble grew. The locomotive's searchlight wasn't visible yet, but its light had already begun to dilute the darkness over the forest with a pale glow, and the bandits began to bustle. The bear shouted something pointing at the tracks, and they moved toward the railbed, apparently deciding the train was their salvation, a chance to leave this place. Zakhar gritted his teeth. He couldn't let them hijack the engine. He rose from the snow, a black ghost in a white hell, and using the noise of the wind and the growing roar of wheels as cover, moved to intercept, not toward the forest, but toward the tracks, where in a minute, a multi-ton steel behemoth would rush past. He knew that at the switch post, in the toolbox, lay a signal lantern and, more importantly, a heavy track crowbar used to move rails, and the leader noticed the movement with his peripheral vision. He spun around sharply and fired, the bullet kicking up snow at Zakhar's feet. But the old man didn't stop. He was already running, zigzagging toward the coveted box, hearing the bear stomping heavily behind, forgetting his pain in pursuit of prey. It was a race with death, where the prize was the life not only of Zakhar, but of those on the train, and the old man was ready to bet everything. Zakhar yanked the frozen lid of the track box, tearing his nails to the quick, but he didn't feel the pain. Adrenaline boiled in his blood, dulling the cold, and inside, among oily rags and wrenches, lay it, the heavy, forged crowbar, a tool crude but reliable as death itself. The old man's fingers closed on the icy metal, and the weight of the iron gave him a confidence he so lacked with bare hands, while the leader was already 10 paces away. He walked, shielding his face with his elbow from the blinding searchlight of the locomotive, which was bearing down on them like a roaring mountain of fire and steam. "Stop, Grandpa, I'll shoot!" The bandit's scream drowned in the roar of wheels, but Zakhar saw the flash of the shot. The bullet pinged off the rail at his feet, striking sparks because the leader was in a hurry. He realized that if the train slipped past, they would be left alone in the snowy desert, and then the cold would finish them off faster than a bullet. He wanted to jump onto the footboard, or use the old man as a shield to stop the train, but Zakhar had no intention of being a shield. He stepped forward, not toward the forest, but straight onto the embankment, blocking the bandit's path, and raised the crowbar like a shaft. The searchlight beam hit his eyes, blinding both for a moment, and in this white haze, Zakhar turned into a shadow, a phantom of vengeance. The leader froze, trying to aim at the dancing silhouette, but Zakhar didn't give him that second. Grunting, he brought down the crowbar, aiming not at the head, but at the shoulder, at the arm holding the revolver. The blow was terrible. The crunch of bone was audible even through the clatter of cars. The Nagant flew into the snowbank, and the bandit howled, doubling over. But the inertia of the train was relentless. The air wave from the locomotive, moving at full speed, hit them both like a giant fist. Zakhar was thrown aside into the loose snow. He rolled head over heels, letting go of the crowbar, and the world spun in a carousel of snow, lights, and noise, while the leader, losing his balance, couldn't hold on to the icy embankment. His feet slipped, and he, waving his good arm, fell backward, right under the flashing, clanking wheels of the freight train. No scream was heard, only a dull, wet thud, and the black body disappeared under the steel rims, instantly ground up by the monstrous force of inertia, while the train, brakes squealing, rushed past, sparks showering from under the brake shoes like rain. The engineer, spotting people on the tracks, yanked the emergency brake, but the loaded train couldn't stop instantly. Cars flashed by one after another, boxcars, flat cars with timber, tank cars, until finally, with a screech and a grind, the train stopped 100 meters from the switch, and silence fell, even more deafening after the roar, broken only by the hissing of steam from the locomotive valves and the howling of the wind. Zakhar lay in the snowbank, looking at the black sky where ragged clouds raced. He was alive, whole, except for bruises, but had no strength to stand. And through the veil in his eyes, he saw people with lanterns running from the tail of the train, their beams dancing on the snow, snatching bloody traces of the massacre. "And what about the bear?" Zakhar raised himself on his elbow with difficulty, looking back, and saw that the second bandit, that same giant, never made it to the tracks. He was sitting in the snow 20 paces away, leaning back against a telegraph pole, and wasn't moving. The axe wound, the frost, and blood loss had done their job. He had frozen to death, never realizing his partner was gone. A conductor ran up to Zakhar, a mustached man in a uniform greatcoat. He shone a lantern in the old man's face, asking fearfully if he was alive, to which Zakhar wheezed, spitting out viscous saliva, that he was alive. Brother. Alive. Then there was commotion. Gendarmes who rode in the tail of the train, inspection of the scene, short, clipped phrases of the protocol. The leader's body was collected in pieces along the track. A gruesome sight. Even experienced soldiers looked away. And in the sack the bandits dragged with them, there really was church gold. Chalices, frames, crosses stolen from a monastery in the provincial capital. Zakhar sat in the warmth of the heated boxcar, wrapped in a government blanket, and drank hot, sweet tea poured for him by a compassionate conductor. His hands were still trembling, but no longer from cold, but from receding tension. He looked out the window at his small, dark hut standing lonely by the embankment, and thought that tomorrow he would have to put in glass, wash the floor of strangers' blood, and live again. Live on. Listen to the wind's howl and the clack of wheels, knowing that he, an old track walker, didn't trample this earth for nothing. The train started moving, taking away the dead bandits and their cursed gold, but Zakhar remained. He jumped off the footboard when the train gathered speed and trudged toward his home, where on the porch, whining and tucking his tail, Polkan met him. The dog had gotten out through the broken window and was waiting for his master. Zakhar ruffled his friend's shaggy head, feeling an unbidden tear crawl down his cheek, and said quietly, looking at the gray, cold dawn breaking over the taiga, that they had survived and would live. And they entered the house, which smelled of burning and death, to drive out that smell, stoke the stove, and return order to this world, which they had defended through this long, endless night.